Hello and welcome to the Centre for Policy Studies event. My name is Eamon Ives. I'm the Head of Energy and Environment Policy here at the CPS, and I'll be chairing today's proceedings. Our event today is all about carbon pricing and how it might be relied upon to decarbonise the UK economy. But we'll also be interested in discussing questions around how to build political acceptance around carbon pricing. And critically, how can we ensure that a greater emphasis on carbon pricing doesn't come at the expense of the least well off or indeed damage the competitiveness of British business? A lot of our discussion today, I hope, will be based around one of the Centre for Policy Studies' most recently published papers, Pricing Pollution Properly. In that report, which, as I'll give a disclaimer, is written by me, we made the case for carbon pricing to play a greater role in the government's overall strategy for decarbonising the economy in line with its 2050 and indeed earlier climate goals. We also paid attention to how to shield vulnerable individuals from any potential price rises which wider carbon pricing might entail. Following our research, we propose that the government explores how carbon dividends could help mitigate any additional costs, in the sense rebating cash back to individuals which would be raised by a more comprehensive carbon price. We also explored other options, namely tax reforms. Given the sorts of revenues that wider carbon pricing would generate, it would be perfectly possible for the Treasury to use that money to fund tax breaks for either individuals or corporations so that they don't lose out as a result. I should also note that Pricing Pollution Properly was generously sponsored by the Everco Trust, who've also partnered with us on today's event. And I'll introduce Phil shortly, who can talk a little about their interest in this space. Before doing that, however, I'll just give a quick run through some of the boring details about how the next 50 minutes or so will unfold. So we'll begin with remarks from each of our excellent panelists before moving on to a short discussion, picking up on some of the points they've raised. After that, we'll be taking questions from the audience and hopefully providing some half-coherent answers. If you're watching via Zoom, you can do that with the Q&A function and not the chat box, please. So submit your questions there. Alternatively, you can tweet us on Twitter. Feel free to do that using @CPS Think Tank as the handle. You can start submitting your questions whenever you want, so maybe in reaction to what any of our speakers are saying while they're giving their remarks. And the earlier you do that, the more likely it is that I'll pick you, so don't delay in getting those in. But with all that boring stuff now out of the way, I'm delighted to bring in our first speaker. So Jerome Mayhew is the Member of Parliament for Broadland, which is in Norfolk, and was first elected in 2019. He also sits on the Environmental Audit Committee and is a Vice Chair on the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Environment. So all in all, I think he's more than qualified to be with us this afternoon. So Jerome, if you'd like to unmute and kick us off, that would be brilliant.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I think we need to start off with what our goal is. And for me, our goal is to unleash the power of the free market to help to solve some of our carbon emissions issues. The reason is that currently our market is totally blind, or almost totally blind, to the cost of carbon. And so we're not getting true exchange. When you buy a product, you put in your cash on this side, and you pay for the raw ingredients, and you pay for the profit motive, you pay for transport and other overheads. But what you don't pay for currently, in most circumstances, is the cost of the carbon. Now, carbon is part of that transaction, but you're not paying for it. And so you're not getting true exchange. Why does that matter? It matters because it means that as a consumer, we cannot choose. We cannot look at two products and say which one's the high carbon and which one's the low carbon product. We're blind. They're the same price. And without the ability of the consumer to feed in the millions and millions of individual messages of the unseen hand of the economy, to give messages to manufacturers that actually we prefer the cheaper, lower carbon product, then we're not giving them the incentive to to produce those products in the first place. And the market ends up actually causing the problem rather than helping to solve the problem. Now, I said it's almost blind. It's not totally blind because we've got a carbon floor price, which is about £22 a tonne. We've also got the UK emissions trading scheme, which deals with, it affects about a third of the economy, the domestic economy, for heavy polluting industry, so heavy industry and some transport. Now, I looked at the price of carbon futures for yesterday in preparation for this meeting, and it's really interesting actually because they've risen significantly, and they're currently trading at £68.42 per additional tonne of CO2 equivalent in the UK, and for interest in the EU ETS as of the 1st of December at 76.81 euros. Now, I know this is just the additional price of carbon after you've got all the free coupons which are offered to heavy industry, but it is really interesting that is around about the $75 a ton carbon CO2 equivalent price, which most economists suggest is what consumers would be a level at which consumer power would really be effective in directing long-term change in our economy. So my starter for 10 is we need to be able to have a price for carbon across the economy. Why don't we do it other than the annoying level at the moment is because we're afraid of carbon leakage. We're afraid of if we put up essentially the price of energy in the domestic market, we disadvantage our domestic manufacturing base. They either go out of business, go abroad, or they get undercut by imports which are sucked in from a higher carbon, therefore lower cost economy. And the way we deal with that is by some form, well, there's two options. One is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I'm very interested in, and the Environmental Audit Select Committee is currently undertaking an investigation into. The second one, and it may not be either or, it may be both and, is product standards. So when you buy a product, the standard for that product requires you to have a certain percentage of low carbon inputs. So that's my starter for 10, the goal and the problem and how we go about solving that problem.
Thank you very much for that, Jerome. I think that nicely sets us up for the rest of our discussion. So next up, we have Josh Buckland. Josh is a partner at Flint Global, specialising in energy, climate and infrastructure policy. Before joining Flint, Josh worked as an energy advisor to both Greg Clark and Andrea Leadsom during their times as Secretaries of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Policy, or Industrial Strategy rather. He's also worked in Number 10 in the Treasury, so again, I think he's exceptionally well placed to provide some pearls of wisdom on the issues we're discussing today. So Josh, if you'd like to come in and give us your introductory remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Eamon, and lovely to see you all today. I was going to cover three very quick things. Firstly, the kind of case for carbon pricing, a little bit about how we go about expanding it, and then lastly, and potentially most importantly, how do we make it politically credible? Where I might slightly repeat some of the things Jerome has said, but I'll try not to. Obviously, as Eamon said, my views are kind of mostly shaped by nearly a decade in government, dealing with when net zero is very much in vogue, but also when it wasn't. So I know some of the political pitfalls around the agenda. Firstly, on the kind of case for carbon pricing, it's clear that net zero is a huge challenge. The scale of investments required, the level of change to the economy and technology, it's not all upside, and there will be a cost. We have to be absolutely clear and straightforward with people that is the case. If that is the basis, the whole economic and fiscal framework has to support it, or at least not get in the way. You don't necessarily need everything to be a green policy, but you clearly need to ensure that net zero runs through decision making and nothing you're doing negatively necessarily impacts it from a direct perspective. At the moment, that's not the case. There's various charges on green products. There's implicit subsidies for fossil fuels in some places. And clearly what that creates, as Jerome has described, is a very inconsistent price of effectively carbon pricing over the economy. To put it into kind of tangible terms, the effective carbon price on a unit of domestic electricity is 4 times that it is on gas. There's an effective carbon subsidy on taking a flight, so you're effectively paid to take a flight in carbon terms. That clearly isn't credible, and critically, it costs us all money, because ultimately the cost that you then have to use to subsidize clean technologies goes up, and that's the cost that either consumers or taxpayers pay. And critically, a point that Jerome made, it weakens the market incentives to effectively innovate and drive new technology investment. And without that carbon pricing system or signal, it's harder to see how you deliver net zero at least cost, which is ultimately what we all want to see. So if you take the assumption that you do need to create a more consistent carbon price across the economy, how do you actually go about doing it? I think I've done some kind of analysis and work in this space, and I think there's kind of three things to keep in mind. Firstly, we shouldn't just focus on raising revenue. Ultimately, carbon pricing is around changing behaviours and stoking technology innovation. We're not trying to find permanent sources of new tax income, because ultimately the tax income we create should reduce over time. And ultimately, we shouldn't be looking for new sources of revenue. We should be trying to keep the overall tax base as low as possible. And critically within that, you can't just look at short-term measures. Windfall taxes, for example, don't drive long-term behaviour change, which is ultimately what we need on the net zero side. Secondly, changes need to be demonstrably fair. We've all seen the Gilets Jaunes movement. We've seen that you need a credible and pragmatic framework rather than knee-jerk interventions. And that framework needs to be developed over time, and critically, it needs to look at how it can retain public support. And then thirdly, you can't just expect to tax your way out of a problem. Carbon taxation is one measure. You also need regulatory frameworks, subsidies, and clearly kind of a sensible market structure that allows companies to innovate. And all of those need to be seen in tandem. So what does that mean for kind of actually going ahead and making progress? I think two key areas. Firstly, and this is what Jerome has said, we need to look at how we create a more consistent carbon price across the economy. So look at areas where there's particular implicit subsidies, look at areas and where there is even the tax burden is too high effectively, and actually there's an opportunity to reduce it. Domestic electricity is a great example of that. Secondly, clearly, we need to try and prioritize action in sectors where changes are most needed. So aviation is a good example, as well as other forms of pollution. And clearly, there's opportunities to make progress now, whilst leaving some of the more politically charged areas for later on. Agriculture is a good example of that. But even with that kind of slightly more cautious and pragmatic approach, there is clearly a significant political challenge when it comes to carbon taxation, especially from a distributional perspective. We are all aware that there is a cost of living challenge on the horizon and inflation biting. Therefore, what we absolutely need to do is create a cautious and pragmatic approach that strengthens the political consensus around climate change rather than decreases it through reactionary policy. I think there's two key ways to do that. Jerome has mentioned one, the potential for a carbon border tax or an equivalent, which ensures that we aren't just offshoring industry, and that creates business investment and market creation here in the UK rather than abroad. And then secondly, we should think carefully about how we flow some of the tax revenues that we're generating back to end consumers. That can be used to either offset some of the distributional consequences, support those on lower incomes to kind of buy an EV or whatever it may be, or invest in innovation alongside the private sector. All of those things can be done with some of the revenue that's raised, and that will show there is direct value beyond simply, obviously, trying to address climate change. I'll leave it there in terms of opening thoughts, and very keen to get into discussion after that. Back to you, Eamon.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Josh. Again, lots of interesting points to pick up on in our discussion later. Before introducing our final speaker, I'd just like to quickly remind everybody watching that we will obviously be taking questions later. If you'd like to query or respond to anything our speakers have said so far, please go right ahead and put your questions and comments in the Q&A box below. The more we get in, the easier my job as chair becomes. But I'm delighted to bring in our last speaker now, Phil Levermore from Ebico Trust. As I mentioned earlier, Ebico Trust were our partner organisation, not just for this event, but also for the paper we put out in October. Phil has been a long-standing advocate for in the energy world for affordable, sustainable energy, and I'm delighted he can join us here today. So Phil, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Phil Levermore, and I'd like to give you a little background, if you will, into the Ebico Trust and why we've been such a keen supporter of Eamon and the Centre for Policy Studies in their research into this vital subject of a fair transition for the UK to a net zero economy. Ebico was founded nearly 25 years ago at a time when the UK's energy market was changing rapidly from one of centralised state-owned companies to a more liberalised market where private companies and thus private capital were taking the lead. We at Ebico supported this direction of travel, but we realised that change could only be sustained in such a politically sensitive area as domestic electricity and gas supplies if it was genuinely fair. Ebico was launched as a not-for-profit home energy provider dedicated to providing affordable and sustainable home warmth to low-income households. Now, much has changed in the energy market over the past quarter century, and now our whole economy is facing a generational challenge in transitioning to net zero. While completely supporting this evolution, we still believe that for it to be successful, changes must not only be effective in eliminating greenhouse gases, but it's critical that they are genuinely and popularly seen to be as fair to all as possible. 10 years ago, we set up Ebico's charitable trust to direct the company's financial surpluses back to the wider community. And the Ebico Trust has two change models. We provide help and support to entrepreneurs and innovators who are developing ideas and business ventures likely to make sustainable warmth more affordable. With delivery partners, we're running the Ebico Sustainable Warmth Incubator Programme for entrepreneurs across the UK to help them develop their ideas into viable businesses and to attract investment. We also support research into an effective and fair energy transition. And to that end, we're keen to support and promote the recommendations of this CPS report. Now, having been professionally involved in the UK's energy market for the past 35 years, a period of many changes, I've noted one consistent truth. They have a saying in the military that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. In a similar way, and whilst perhaps Josh might push back on this, government's energy policies, in my view, have tended to become amended out of all recognition once home energy prices start to rise. My recommendation to new arrivals to the energy market has therefore been, if the success of your business requires the consistent application of a government's energy policy for more than 3 years, find a new one. Now, the beauty of Eamon's recommendations are therefore threefold. They would be effective in reducing carbon in the economy. They would be progressive in relation to home incomes and thus seen as fair. And they would be simpler and more transparent than having rafts of potentially cross-cutting levies and subsidies, and thus more likely to be consistently applied, to the profound benefit of entrepreneurs and wider society. And I commend them to you.
Marvellous, thank you, Phil, and indeed Jerome and Josh before you. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to take full advantage of my chair's privilege and just pick up on a few points we've heard from our panellists. As you went first, I think it's only fair that we begin back with you, Jerome. You obviously mentioned in your remarks the discussion about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which could maybe be applied in tandem to a wider carbon pricing policy and may well be seen as absolutely integral if we are going to have more carbon pricing. Without sort of putting you on the spot, how likely do you think that is in terms of adoption? They've kind of been talked about for a few years, and I think we've seen a lot more interest in them recently, particularly from organisations like the European Union. Do you think we're getting closer in the UK to breaking through on CBAMs?
Well, first with the European Union, you'll remember that on the 15th of July this year, the European Union published a draft bill to bring in a EU-wide CBAM by 2023. Now that's not insignificant. So from my perspective, irrespective of whatever your view on CBAMs for the UK economy, it's no longer a level playing field. We're going to have, coming from one side, it's likely to have anyway, a European Union CBAM, which we're going to be on the outside of. So we need to respond one way or the other. And I think that has heightened, it's sharpened the pencils in the Treasury and in Bayes and in Number 10 as to what we think about this. And I think there's a lot of interest. I don't want to make claims for other people, but my understanding is there's a lot of interest in government about at least assessing the credibility of a UK CBAM, the overwhelming preference to be part of a multilateral approach to this, and that a go-it-alone CBAM would very much be one of last resort. But again, it's not just from the EU that you're getting this pressure. You're also, at COP26, there was the announcement between the USA and the European Union dealing with a low-carbon club. I'm going to get the name wrong slightly, but a low-carbon club for steel, and that was open to like-minded countries. Well, cast your mind back to 1946, and that was the beginnings of the European Union, was the Coal and Steel Federation. You can see how that could be developed over time to be a carbon club or a CBAM. Yeah,
interesting. I think so. I don't know whether you got any sort of strong views on this, but would you sort of imagine if we are going to get a CBAM eventually, would it sort of start off quite gradually, maybe applied to discrete sectors, like steel, aluminium, fertilizer, coal, hydrocarbons? Do you think that might be a more likely sort of method of introduction?
Overwhelmingly, yes, because the biggest pushback from colleagues of mine who aren't immediate fans of CBAM is that it's very complicated, and they equate complication and assessment at the border with statism. My response is, first of all, make it simple, stupid. So start with the big 5 emitters, which account for roughly 2/3 of emissions anyway. So that's cement, fertilizers, aluminium, steel, and iron. And then as you grow in competence and therefore confidence, you can grow it out to other aspects of the economy. The second point is that what is more statist is, I'm going to take that back. it's absolutely not statist, because what you're doing is you're unleashing, you're giving the economic signal to allow the free market to work. That is exactly the role of a pro-free market government. The alternative is that you deal with this through subsidies, which is enormously statist, because you're taking through general taxation other people's money, and then you have the government picking winners and saying, I'm going to invest £800 million in hydrogen. Well, maybe hydrogen is part of the solution. I don't know. Often the government gets it wrong. It's much better to free up the market to take those decisions for you.
And maybe just remaining with you very quickly before I bring in our other panelists, I think something which we often hear, CBAM's obviously applied on sort of the more industrial aspects of the economy. How do you think that sort of resonates with maybe some of your colleagues in the red wall or the blue wall or whatever we're meant to call it nowadays? You're obviously in Norfolk. I don't know whether that quite counts, but I think it sort of seems like an argument that maybe could resonate quite well in those parts of the country, which obviously the government's very interested in as part of its levelling up agenda, as part of its sort of general strategy going forwards. Do you think measures like that could have particular resonance with parts of those parts of the country?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's really noticeable in the investigation which the Environmental Audit Select Committee is currently undertaking. The evidence from UK Steel and Make UK is supportive of a CBAM, because they see the pressure that we've been put under, where our domestic economy, I said in my earlier comments that about a third of it has a form of carbon pricing attached to it. 0% of imports has a carbon price attached to it. And so we have created this crazy system where we're penalizing our own domestic industry and therefore facilitating, giving a direct competitive advantage to manufacturers elsewhere. Now, there may be great reasons to import products, but let's not make it our own tax policy to encourage imports at the expense of a manufacturing renaissance in the Midlands and the North.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. So maybe bringing in Josh, given your sort of former lives in various parts of the government, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about sort of maybe some of the bigger blockers or advances of carbon pricing in the government. Where do you sort of see some of those obstacles coming from, and how might we be able to sort of overcome those?
Yeah, it's a very good point. So there's some nakedly political ones, and largely those are driven by obviously kind of the level of directness to consumer bills. So anything that touches on domestic gas or energy use generally is very controversial, and clearly anything that touches on kind of pump prices is also equally controversial. And actually, in some ways, that's for justifiable reasons, because they are potentially very significantly distributional consequences for going further in that space, in that area. And therefore, anything you do in that space has to ultimately address and be respectful of those distributional consequences. So you need to think about ways you can support low-income households. You need to think about ways that you can exempt or get other things that you can do. But clearly, those areas are always going to be difficult. And clearly, in some ways, actually stay away from those spaces for now. And actually, thankfully, on something like, say, transport and kind of cars, fuel duty, which is an implicit carbon price, is already significant. And actually, there is no real case for going further in the near term in passenger vehicles. So it's a good example of how you don't need it. Similarly, on the domestic side, you can look at how you rebalance between gas and electricity to ensure that actually you're just creating a positive carbon signal rather than something that is necessarily distributionally negative. So there are ways around those, but they are kind of difficult political challenges. To the point that Phil made earlier, clearly those are harder in a world of rising inflation. And with RPI at nearly 6%, you kind of clearly got a clear challenge around how you make progress in those areas in the near term. The other challenge is ultimately technology readiness. So obviously it's easy to say let's slap a kind of carbon price on something, but actually unless the technology is at least in the right framework and is generating in the right way, then actually it's quite hard for business and companies to respond. And therefore what you need, and this kind of point I made earlier, is yes, absolutely start internalizing the carbon price. To the point Jerome made, that will definitely drive markets, it will drive capital, it will shift things in the right direction, but also think about what's needed alongside. So targeted regulation, potentially innovation cash from the public sector, kind of public R&D is a great driver of kind of collaboration with the private sector. And clearly there is an opportunity to drive that sort of joined up approach. If you take that sort of programmatic approach, that at least means that any internalization of a carbon price then adds value. And that's the thing that really needs to be thought through, rather than just a single intervention that you hope people react to, because that's just doesn't necessarily reflect the realities.
No, I think that's definitely something critical to keep it in the front of our minds. Phil, maybe turning to you. You've obviously been sort of studying the energy market for an incredibly long time, and I'm sure have a very detailed appreciation of it, and have seen policies come and go throughout the years. When we're talking about these issues of kind of sustainability and affordability, particularly for those on the lowest incomes, and especially now in the sort of the current grip of the energy crisis, which is currently striking around the world, do you think there is that sort of trade-off? And maybe if there is, how can it be balanced between sort of going green and keeping costs down for consumers? Are there any sort of policies, maybe carbon pricing reform, maybe there are others that you can think of that would be particularly good at sort of mitigating those challenges?
Well, one of the things I was thinking about, I mean, we haven't actually spoken about it thus far today, has been your idea regarding the, if you like, the redistribution of the income the Exchequer makes from charging the carbon tax. And you make it quite clear in your paper that you believe that this shouldn't be seen as a tax, a drain on the economy per se, but should be redistributed out to individuals. I think your suggestion is, which I'd certainly support, to make it more progressive a taxation than otherwise would be if it was just placed on energy bills, for instance. Now, I think that's a really interesting idea. And if it was personalised in that way, if and this is probably a big if, but if something along the lines of individual savings accounts could be set up for each individual once they turn 16 or whatever, and a regular stream of money paid into that year by year or month by month, ideally, from the benefits from of the carbon tax, then that would certainly make people feel they have more invested in it, and they perhaps understand it a bit more, and that yes, prices were going up, but they were also getting, as a result of it, these income streams into their bank account. But perhaps as importantly, you could actually, or financial institutions, let's say banks, could structure financial products based upon the lower risk of that inheriting that income stream, and it's coming from government, to be able to offer quite low interest or no interest advances to people to take advantage of these new technologies. So, for instance, to buy a Nissan Leaf, other vehicles are available, of course, but or to pay for the solar panels on their roof, or to replace their defunct boiler with an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump. So in that way, people would buy into it a bit more, and I think a lot more, and therefore it would feel more of a project for the nation.
No, I sort of see where you're coming from, absolutely, on that. Maybe sort of just broadening the question out to Jerome and Josh. There's obviously, as I sort of referred back to earlier, the energy crunch that we're going through at the moment, different sort of policy ideas swirling around. I remember hearing one before the budget that the Labour Party might sort of look at tweaking VAT rates on domestic energy bills. Maybe turning to you, Jerome, are there any sort of policy suggestions which have caught your eye recently about how bill payers could be insulated through these next few rocky months, or even longer than that?
Well, on the bigger issue, this tax or pricing policy, it can be entirely revenue neutral. I mean, what it does is it gives an ability for the government to take decisions on how to spread money around the economy. We are applying a corrective price to exchange, as I talked about earlier, and a byproduct of that, and I think it's absolutely right, should consider that to be a byproduct, is the revenue gets its hands on an amount of cash, hopefully a declining amount of cash over time. What they choose to do with that is entirely up to them. So what I don't want is for the tail of how do you make this progressive, regressive, fair, unfair, that tail to wag the dog of the policy decision in the first place, which is that we unlock the power of the free market, because that is the big win. And then the rest of it is just how you make it happen in practice. So I think there are lots of different ways you can skin this particular cat. And some of the ideas in your report and that we've been discussing today are really attractive. Whether they'll be as attractive to the Treasury, hates hypothecation, hates having money sort of squirreled away like that out of their sticky fingers. I don't know. But I think I'm going to stick with the big issue is to get markets and consumers working to solve the problem rather than create it.
And Josh, maybe sort of just throwing that one out to you as well. Any sort of ideas that have kind of crept to mind that you think are looking particularly attractive right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I just on Joe's point about hypothecation, the Treasury's view, absolutely they don't. And I've been on the other side of the fence saying that we should never have it. But there is a nuance, which is they don't necessarily like hypothecation for existing funding streams. Hypothecation for new funding streams is potentially a different question because that's cash they never had. So if we're thinking about areas where there is an opportunity to go further, actually thinking and linking that directly to hypothecation in the immediate term is valuable. They've done the same on roads recently, and actually that shows that there is a principle that works, and actually then garner greater political acceptability. And also to the point Phil made, it's not a completely kind of unique policy. It's done quite a lot around the world. There's states in Canada that do kind of returns. There's some Scandinavian countries that do the same. This idea that you recycle revenue through carbon taxation is a pretty accepted norm elsewhere. So it'd be great, obviously, to see something similar here. In terms of the immediate challenges around policy intervention, I think, of course, you can do something on VAT. The challenge with VAT is it goes to everyone. So it's not necessarily a hugely beneficial measure and doesn't necessarily target those on lower incomes who are going to face the kind of biggest challenges in the immediate term. There is potentially an opportunity to think about how you extend existing supports. There's schemes currently in place like the Warm Homes discount on energy bills. How can you expand that to support and channel support where it's most needed? There are also more comprehensive options as well. So one of the areas that has been talked a lot about recently is, could you remove the green subsidies that currently exist on the electricity bill that both obviously cost consumers money, but also in addition delay the electrification drive that clearly needs to happen and reduce the incentive for individuals to switch to an EV or buy a heat pump. That clearly is something the government is looking at and could be potentially part of an overall solution to try and rebalance on the carbon taxation side as well. The other critical thing in the near term is about how you pay for the cost of the existing market failure we've seen on the retail side. So clearly we're all going to pay as customers for the failure of a series of energy companies. Is there a way where you could say Treasury takes on a loan to cover the costs for those, so you could spread them out over a longer period? Because otherwise a lot of those costs are going to hit consumers next year, just at the point where they're getting hit by global commodity prices, and that's a real risk and ultimately could put a lot of people into fuel poverty. So is there a way that we can try and smooth some of those costs over time to at least kind of build into a fair and more just kind of energy transition as Phil described?
And sort of sticking on that cost point, one of the things you mentioned in your initial remarks was how carbon pricing, what it really would do is create an incentive for companies, entrepreneurs, whoever, to come into the space of developing low carbon tech for whatever reason that might be. Cheaper heat pumps perhaps might be one, hydrogen boilers, generating hydrogen, whatever, is going to fuel domestic energy of the future of 2050. Just how important is that? Does that sort of area get enough sort of press and media attraction that actually we need to bring down the cost of a lot of these green technologies still? And how decisive do you think a carbon price can be in helping to that?
Yeah, so I think I'm actually a bit of a market optimist in this way. I do think, and kind of Jerome kind of hinted at this, that actually if you do the right pricing signals, the market can react. We've seen that in other areas, and clearly an implicit carbon signal, if you're then a CFO of a company, you can see that and stick that into your revenue line and understand that you've then got to adapt. The only challenge is it drives efficiency rather than necessarily kind of complete change. So it's kind of relatively straightforward to see how you would reduce your kind of carbon intensity by 10-15% through the application of kind of certain efficiency improvements to react to that price and reduce the exposure. There is also then the flip side though, how do you then kind of completely revamp your production approach or your fuel intake? And that's potentially a bigger cost, which is more of a challenge. And that probably relates to the upfront cost, which is harder to deal with. That's where innovation cash, R&D has a really important role for the public and private sector, and seeing that in combination with a long-term mechanism is vital. The other thing is, how do you pump prime? So how do you start to drive down the cost of these technologies through early adoption? We've exactly seen that on the EV side, where targeted kind of consumer-orientated support at the outset has helped to drive down costs as the market is innovated. And now you're able to pull that support away. So no subsidy should ever be long-term. It should be about market creation. So there's ways you can do that, but you do need to deal with the upfront costs as well as the ongoing costs.
Thank you for that. Just going to make one plug to anybody watching. We will be taking questions from the audience shortly, so do please get them in. We've had a couple come in and some online as well. So if you're watching and got a burning question to ask any of our panelists, please get it in the question and answer box now. Phil, can I turn back to you to talk about some of the things that sort of Ebico has been doing throughout its history, in terms of kind of challenges that we've maybe seen recently. How do they sort of compare to other issues which we might have had in, previously, and maybe going back a few years or so? We can remember things like the Beast from the East, which obviously create a lot of problems for people, particularly the most fuel insecure. From your perspective, how's sort of the landscape changing? Is it changing at all? And where do you sort of come in on that front?
Well, the current situation is similar in some ways to that which applied in and sorry, this is going back a bit to 2005-06, when we saw a similar jump in almost overnight jump in commodity prices, and that as a result of that, a lot of quite a few of their then much smaller cohort of energy suppliers went to the wall, sadly, because they weren't able to. They didn't have the cash in order to be able to hedge correctly. This time it's a lot worse, of course, because we've got the price cap, and I've gone on record to say that when the price cap was introduced, I felt it was a disaster and waiting to happen. Which sadly has turned out to be. At the time, this is a few years ago, I worked with John Penrose to come up with an alternative idea, which was to have a relative price cap. So therefore, to cap the difference in price a supplier could charge between their cheapest tariff and their standard tariff. And it's fair to say, had we had that in place now, rather than the absolute price cap, I think we'd be in a lot better state. Not least because all the relativities would have remained with the higher price. That said, we are where we are, and a lot of companies were in fact swimming with no shorts, which we're now aware of. Others were badly managed. I think generally speaking, companies have worked very hard to attract customers over the years, and have had to spend a lot of money to do so because it's such a competitive market, which is good for the consumer. But obviously, a lot of those business models were perhaps not as sensible as it appeared at the time. In other words, costs of acquisition were way too high, and the margin available from customers made it unsustainable in the short term. So it's a shame. I think the customer benefited from a high level of competition in the past. Now, I'm afraid because of the price cap, it's going to come around and bite us a bit, and more than a bit. And people are talking about, I'm not sure this is the case or not, perhaps as much as £50 or £60 per customer being the appropriate charge that will be reapplied through the various compensatory mechanisms, which is very unfortunate. And perhaps in hindsight, those that were such strong proponents of the price cap would be less so.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'll be going too much off topic to throw that out to the other panelists, but maybe Jerome, do you have any thoughts about the price cap, and how do you see its longevity? Do you reckon is it going to sort of be bitten too hard, and will it be junks at all next year or anything like that? Do you think?
Well, look, I'm a loyal supporter of the government. So on the one hand, they can do no wrong. On the other hand, would you really have a system that leads to the kind of destruction in value that we've had over the last couple of months? It's clearly worked in a way that hasn't been able to react to the very large scale movement in the base price, and any business. I used to be a businessman before becoming a politician. You know, if you're the amount you can charge is fixed and your costs aren't, it's by definition a very precarious business model. So on that, can I just come back, if I may, though,
by all means,
to the need for government cash to support innovation and investment? I fundamentally do not think that is necessary, because there is a wall of private money out there that is desperate to get involved in the new industrial revolution, the new green industrial revolution. There are literally trillions of pounds in the global economy that is trying to find a home in this sector. All it needs is market signals. That's the role of the government, is to provide clear market signals that then can unlock more money than the government could possibly have available is already out there, ready to go. So I am a huge enthusiast, a huge optimist for the strength of the market here. There is no lack of investment cash at all. And in my view, there is no lack of bright ideas as well and innovation. And you see some of the written evidence that's coming into my committee on areas, you know, as fundamental as things like fertilizer. We talked about agriculture being one of the key sectors that certainly historically hasn't been able to decarbonize. We've got companies like CCM, who's a British company, that is having money thrown at them, as far as I can see. I don't want to give away too many trade secrets, to develop their carbon sequestering fertilizer product, and it's already at a price which is cost competitive. So there are some really interesting, innovating businesses who need a price of carbon to highlight how brilliant they are. Because unless you've got the true cost of the transaction being revealed, they're not being given it's not the support, but just the fair level playing field that they deserve.
Interesting. And sort of just pulling on that thread still, do you think that you talk about the need for signals? Do you think the carbon price, a more comprehensive carbon price, could provide that entirely? Do you think there's other things that need to happen to leverage or unlock that finance that you talked about? Is it regulatory rules? Is there anything else sort of stopping it, which you'd like to see the government sort of?
Well, I think overwhelmingly, from my perspective, it's the price of carbon. But then there will be all sorts of other, you know, when you start digging into the politics of it rather than the economics of it, you can have very simple and elegant economic solutions which are politically wholly unacceptable. So I recognise that it needs to be a mixture of carrot and stick. If it's all price related, then you know, it can be politically unacceptable. And there are lots of different ways that we can help in this regard, whether it's through subsidies or grants. Supporting people who, you know, whenever you change anything, and any policy which is by its design is designed to be disruptive, it's designed to change behavior, designed to affect some businesses negatively, high carbon businesses who haven't innovated, it's going to give them a problem. So there will be losers. It's designed to create losers. And the role of government in the modern society is to smooth out some of the bumps along the way. And I'm absolutely right, we should do that. But the clear message is, if something costs more, you know, it gets passed on eventually to the consumer. And the brilliant thing about that is the consumer then changes the market because they vote with their feet in their wallets.
Josh, you've been waiting patiently. Do you want to come in on either of those, or both of them indeed, innovation and the price cap maybe?
So on the price cap, I won't talk about it too much because I'm not in any way wholly responsible, but maybe partly responsible for some of the policies around that. I think the one thing I would say is it was originally brought in to tackle a specific problem around the loyalty penalty. So disengaged customers paying too much for their energy. What now people see it as is a cost controlling mechanism, which is never what it was meant to be. And it shouldn't be seen as that. You could have a price cap which is more adaptive to the point around when costs move, the price cap should move. And you could also have a price cap which ultimately reflects the kind of more resilient market through financial regulation of the company. So there's a way you can see it working, but I totally agree that the current kind of framework and the way that's interacted with the current crisis has absolutely not worked in the right way. On the innovation, I agree. I think there is a particular role for government on academic research and how it can stoke sensible non-commercial investment in the R&D space, and I think that's a proven kind of win for the UK, and we've got such a strong scientific community. It makes sense to do so. I think mostly, actually, once you're in the kind of full scale-up phase, absolutely it should all be funded by the private sector, and better market signals would help create that. And I think the one thing that I would say, in addition to what Jerome said around kind of market signals, is around information. So one of the things that really is important, and the Chancellor is doing a brilliant job on, is about financial disclosures. So what the market needs is it needs to understand climate risk. It needs to understand where it sits. It needs to then allocate its capital in the right way as a result of that. That doesn't mean to say we should be divesting. It's more about saying there is a sensible financial structure where investors get the information they need to allocate their capital to the bits that Jerome is talking about around clean technology innovation and also market creation. And that is the thing which is then aligns with your market signals to actually create a powerful force for the private sector to then be able to invest. And we all know that the infrastructure funds, the major banks, they have the ability to then drive these new financial products that will then make clean innovation happen at pace. So I think if you see the two things in tandem, actually they can be really significantly powerful, and they will be the decisive factor as to whether we actually solve climate change, because ultimately taxpayers, which is the government cash book, simply isn't powerful enough.
Can I just one thing on the innovation side? I can certainly agree with Jerome that there, in my experience, there's a wall of dry powder investment looking for good investments in opportunities in the zero carbon sector, but from the perspective of the innovator, from the perspective of the entrepreneur, my plea would be to those of you that have any influence on this, keep the policy the same. Please don't change things, because if you've structured a business model on a particular policy, on a set of taxes or a set of grants or whatever, it's not fair on the fair, but it's very, very difficult if that policy changes too swiftly.
I think I'd sort of echo that, and certainly something we heard a lot in terms of our research, whether it's on the report we did with you or indeed a lot of any of our reports looking at sort of business related issues. We've got more than enough instability with the pandemic or Brexit or anything like that, political instability. Changing frameworks of policies tend not to be the most helpful things usually. Turning to some of the questions we've had from the audience, and one that we kind of got emailed in, and sort of zooming out, we've kind of touched on it a little bit in bits and pieces, but looking at the sort of the role or sort of the politics around carbon pricing, typically been quite unfavourable. I think Josh talked about the Gilets jaunes, but I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody on the panel, but I think you often see polling evidence that people kind of understand maybe the principle behind carbon pricing, kind of the polluter pays principle, the sort of, and I think they typically understand that it is or could be regarded as kind of a fair policy mechanism. Jerome, maybe you could sort of bring us in on this, and whether, talking to constituents or colleagues in the House, do you think that sort of people get the idea behind carbon pricing, but it sort of comes up against other challenges, and what might they be in terms of adopting it more wholesale?
Well, the answer is some people get it and other people don't. And the people who don't are the ones who you hear from. So in conversations with my red wall or blue wall, whatever we're calling each other, colleagues, one memorably said, look, I totally get it. We should do these policies, just stop talking about them, because they go down quite badly in his local area. So yeah, let's fix the problem, but ramming it down people's throats in a messaging term, in messaging terms, doesn't go down well in some of the more northern constituencies. So that would be one approach. I think probably actually the better approach is one of education. So we do need to talk about it, but with that awful phrase, pitch rolling, we need to be constantly talking about it and the benefits, not just the costs, which there are some costs, I accept that. I think, Josh, you were saying there are undoubtedly some costs associated with this as well. True. But there are also a huge number of benefits, and we need to start thinking and expressing what those benefits are. So, one not particularly good example is installation of your housing. We are talking about the costs, and they are significant, but we're also talking about living in nicer housing. It's warmer, it's drier, it costs less to heat. This is, social progress. This is, I've got a rug around my legs at the moment because my house is flipping freezing, and I'm too stingy to put the heating on. So I suppose in that sense, it's quite good for climate change. But if I had an insulated house that that ticked over with very low, with a little air source heat pump on it, that would be a better quality of life. So let's talk about that and the advances that we are planning to make over the next 20 years, and not just, oh, it's going to put the price up.
Josh, do you have any comments on that? I know that you wrote a paper of your own quite recently for another brilliant think tank. In terms of the research which you were doing behind that, did you kind of get that sense that there kind of is that acceptability around carbon pricing, but it's sort of when the rubber hits the road that it sort of crashes a little bit and people become a bit more skeptical of it?
Yeah, I think it's the first rule of politics. It's not just a climate change thing, right? Like we talk about the need to fund social care adequately, but as soon as there is a debate then about funding social care, it becomes kind of politically more controversial. And in those areas, government has actually bitten off and been brave, which is brilliant to see. It kind of creates a bit of a precedent here, I think, as well. I think there's a tactical piece. There's stuff you can do which is actually potentially more politically positive, and you see this through the polling. So a frequent flyer levy, which essentially would create a more kind of indirect kind of carbon price on those that are using flights more, is actually very popular because people understand it and get it and it makes sense. So there's things you can do similarly on kind of switch to road pricing over time as fuel duty revenues decline. There's stuff you can do to kind of support people who have driving EVs, whatever it may be. And actually there's ways you can make this politically attractive. There's also things you absolutely shouldn't do or talk about. So the idea that we should be starting to tax meat consumption is mad. We're not in a world where that is politically acceptable, but also distributionally it's a horrendous thing to do because food is a base commodity. So there's stuff you can do which kind of helps you to create a politically credible package and that is tactical and sensible and helps you build up the momentum behind it. And as you say, Jerome, as then kind of this becomes more of a focus of the political debate more generally, that then becomes easier to deal with. The other thing I completely agree with is the benefit point. So let's talk about the positives and actually think about them creatively. So if you insulate your home, Jerome, and you put in a heat pump, actually your home over time should be worth more because actually the person who's going to eventually have to do that if it wasn't done would have to pay for it. So actually you can see a premium, and actually that's where the banks can start flowing in money because they can offer more competitively priced mortgages on more energy efficient homes. And actually you suddenly create, well, my house is worth more, that's great. Similarly on the car side, actually people are finding that secondhand EVs hold up their value better than ICE vehicles. So again, there's an opportunity there around kind of potential value creation. So I think we can talk about those opportunities and those benefits, but we just need to think about carbon pricing alongside that in a way which is politically pragmatic and sensible. And that's the kind of core of the work that kind of I've done. I know you've done as well, Eamon. And I think that's just the way we need to think about it to help government with that thread, the kind of very, very difficult needle.
Yeah, I think any mention of meat tax or anything is guaranteed to get bad coverage in the Sun, and it sort of dies on a hill there, doesn't it? We've had another question in from Alex Mawson, who works at the CPS, full disclosure, and he's asked, and maybe I'll pitch this to Jerome, how can a carbon border adjustment mechanism be introduced without destabilizing the global trading system that is already pretty delicate? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think he makes reference to the World Trade Organization rules, and I suppose there's two ways of looking at this. So again, a bit like my last comment, is this policy is designed to change consumer behavior. So it does have winners and losers, and some of those losers may well be from high carbon emitting economies, for example, China. And I think one of the government's key hesitations about a CBAM is what that might do to our relations with China, which have their ups and downs at the best of times. So I think this is a really relevant factor. That said, the way that you can minimize risk is by a multilateral approach. So we have a degree of political cover now, if you want to use that sort of terminology, by coming along with the European Union, going in lockstep with the European Union. Then you've suddenly got a very large number of economies saying the same thing, cooperating with the United States, and their nascent move in this direction as well, I think gives us a degree of political cover right now. The other thing to mention is that there is an exception under the WTO rules for environmental measures. And given, as long as this is applied, a CBAM is applied wholly transparently, so that you are imposing on imports exactly the same measures that you impose on your domestic economy, then the advice that I've seen suggests that that would come within the exception, the environmental exception of WTO rules. Either way, I don't think we should let that get in the way of progress. The best outcome is the world suddenly discovers they want to solve this problem, globally, and we all come up with an international price for carbon. But I'm not holding my breath. So yes, a CBAM is a second best, but a multilateral CBAM is the realistic first best in my view.
Excellent. Hopefully that answers the question, Alex. Just before we wrap up, because we're sort of coming up on time, I just want to hand back over to Phil for some thoughts from him.
Thank you, Eamon. Yeah, I think fascinating discussion this afternoon, and certainly I've learned a lot. I do take Jerome's point about the need to focus on the main issue, which is obviously the economic effect of a tax on carbon actually being the thing that enables us to differentiate as consumers between high and low carbon goods and services. But I would, in terms of its political acceptability, I think what will be key will be the way in which that money is used. And I think perhaps we certainly we need to not lose sight of that. In order for this to, in a democratic society, for this to be accepted and acceptable, an additional tax on carbon, there will have to be some obvious and clear to all benefit from that, and not just obviously in the longer term, which of course we all expect and hope in terms of lower global warming, but also in terms of things that people can do with the money. So in other words, I really do strongly feel that the redistributive aspects of a carbon tax are in fact and politically as important as the economic effects on people's purchasing decisions.
Brilliant, thank you, Phil. Really nice way to round off what I think has been a fascinating discussion. I fully agree, and I hope we've shed some new light on the topic of carbon pricing and related issues to do with it. I'm grateful to all of our speakers today, and indeed for you at home who've been getting in your questions. Now, even as Christmas is approaching and people are maybe winding down for the year, the CPS is going to keep churning out reports and events, and to find out all about them, the best thing to do is to go to our website and sign up for our newsletter. If you're on Twitter, you can follow the CPS at CPS Think Tank. I'm at Eamon Ives. If this event hasn't entirely satisfied your craving for energy policy discussion, I can let you know that we'll be hosting a panel in a couple of weeks' time on the 14th of December. We're going to be joined by Jerome's colleague, John Penrose MP, for that. So please do keep an eye out for that one. Other than that, I'd just like to say thank you once again to all my panelists. Thank you to you for watching, and have a wonderful rest of the day.